Okay, so this is our last portion, and I think it's a kind of, this is the moment that you weigh between should we add more new or should we just kind of let the things settle, and kind of do a wrap and of what are the things that stand out of the learning of today. Where you find yourself at and so forth. I only was able to get glimpses of a few of the sessions, so I can't really build on those because I was doing a Q&A with all the people who are online. But maybe what we can do, since I think I'm one of the least that you've had the opportunity to do is ask me questions, is to get a sense as to what you would want to hear from me more of at this moment. What are some of the questions you have for me? Let's start with that. And can I get some of the volunteers to walk around with the mic so I can take notes? That would be helpful. Right here, right here, right here, just so that... do you have mics? How many mics do you have? 2. You have 2? Okay. All right. So go, and we're going to make these questions very brief. And by the way, for those of you who are not comfortable with the questions, you can always say, I have a friend. You know, somebody once told me. There's all these ways. Yeah. Start here in front. I'm going to take a bunch, and then I will put them together. Yeah.
Hi. We talked a lot about power.
Closer.
We talked a lot about power today, and not a lot about money. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how money affects the relationships, in particular in cases where she makes more.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Yes.
In this polarized environment, what is your advice for how we can set a context that allows this conversation to happen in other places too?
Mm-hmm. How do we take this conversation outside? Keep going.
Hi. How do you see the masculinity paradox?
Yep.
How do you work with women who have the contradictory impulse that's so familiar to so many of us, to want a man who you can crash up against, and want a man to be vulnerable, and yet when you find a man who's vulnerable, not not be critical of that? How do you work with women who have that paradox or that those contradictory desires?
Yeah. It's a great question.
Hi.
You know, this is the moment where all the questions you ask are the next day. So are you ready for an all night? This is like when the conversation really becomes interesting, right? Okay, yes.
How do you honor anger that trauma victims might have, women or men, while at the same time not alienating or further shaming the other side of that partner, the other partner?
Say that again. The anger that I have about something that happened to me with somebody else and that I bring to you.
So if there's one victim who has been traumatized, one side of the partner was traumatized by the other, how do we honor and allow the anger without shaming or shutting down or guilting the other person? How do you honor it in a healthy way?
Mine relates to the first question with regards to power and money when the wife makes no money.
So mine comes to the point of the male being vulnerable and then me not needing, or the woman not needing to have to be the caregiver. Because to me, that's the nuance that's bugging me about it. You know?
No. Give me the bug.
You know, so if I think, like, I do want somebody that's vulnerable and emotional and then masculine in the traditional sense, which that paradox exists. But then when I think about, like, today when we saw earlier the two men, like, connecting, I felt personally like oh my God, if they're going to be that like sweet, am I going to have to be a caregiver to them? And I think that that is the nuance that I've been thinking about all day. That's like been churning, and I've trying to been put clear in my own head. And yeah, if you could speak more to that.
Yeah.
I have one over here.
Okay. Yeah.
My question's actually very, very similar to that question. I just worded it differently in case it adds something. I'll ask it anyway.
Bring the mic closer to you.
Some of the women I'm working with, I've noticed a strong resistance to that male vulnerability and that need for emotional needs being met or emotional connection, specifically because their personal erotic narratives require a sense of dominance and a sense of protection from their men. So just the one word I haven't heard a lot of today is arousal. How is arousal impacted by the true introduction of male emotional vulnerability within couples who are striving for greater erotic intimacy?
Okay. All right. Here's the thing. I can't answer these questions. I can riff on these questions. And I also think that my faculty here, for those of you who have something to say about these questions, just join me. I mean, rather than me standing here, just raise your hand and I'll get the mic to you. I know you spread out a little bit. But so the first one is really about women, about money in relationships. And what does it mean for women to make more money, and what does it mean for women to make no money, and all of that? I think the thing that I'm more interested in to explore at this moment around this is like, can people do that which they are most competent to do? I mean, I see plenty of couples where the woman or one partner, if it's two men, two women, one partner is really good at going outside and doing that part, and the other one actually is much better staying at home. In same-sex couple, it's a different negotiation than in straight couples. Now I'm standing like Paul. Where is Paul? Now, every time I'm going to stand like this, I'm going to think of you. I find, look, it's difficult for many women that I have worked with so far, not all, but quite often, when she makes more. When she makes more, and especially when she makes more, here's the thing. When she makes more and she says to him, at least if I was the one not working, or if I was home, I would be doing A, B, C, D, E. And he's saying, look, I'm taking care of whatever career that he may be doing. You have heard that whole conversation. And in a way that I don't hear from men, particularly because I think that men have been just basically raised to believe that that's the way things are. So they don't feel like, why me? And the thing that I have found that is, and I'm answering it from the point of view of the woman now, not the man, that I have actually heard myself say to the women is this. And sometimes they complain, and I have to, why am I, and I have to do and all that. And I say, but can we start by looking at the freedom that it gives you? Because the truth is that the majority of these women would actually not want to change it. They would maybe want less burden, less responsibility, but they wouldn't want to not do that which they are doing. I'm talking professional women now in this instance, because I'm seeing who I'm listening to. And so the thing is, how do you, when you begin to change these roles, how do you not as a woman say, I've been in my masculine the whole day? What does that mean? Am I in my masculine here today? I've been working the whole day. I'm not in anything. I'm in my working mode. It's this kind of gendered way of thinking about it. Why am I in my masculine? Because I have had to take authority, because I have responsibility, because I have agency here, because I'm commanding the room. Is that masculine? Or is that just competent, professional, whatever you want to call it? So that language is really, and I have a hard time when I come home to regress back into my feminine, and you can kind of see this whole language, yeah? So a part of this is, when is it important to have a gendered conversation, and when is it actually not useful to have a gendered conversation? And to play with that, in the instance of the person who does not work and doesn't earn the money, or in the instance of what you're talking about in terms of the arousal and the vulnerability and all of that, what I will say is this. When a relationship becomes parental, meaning that there is a child and an adult, meaning that there is a parent and a child, in that sense, and that's a very different kind of caregiving than the one that you, lady in the second row with your blue thing, are talking about, which is that you instantly take caring, and you maternalize it. When you maternalize it, you will experience the ambivalence, because you will start to infantilize the man and you will be insulting. Bottom line is it's insulting too. You know, there is a way of caregiving that belongs to two adults. It doesn't instantly have to become hierarchical. And now it's not hierarchical in the gender terms, it's hierarchical in the parental terms. And every one of these relationships will be a sexual killer. Because if your head is screwed up right on your shoulders, you don't want sex in the family. So this is one of the number one death knells for sex, is a parentified and a parental relationship. Do you understand? Doesn't matter who is in what role. And those very same people, by the way, who are, I saw a couple recently, she hasn't booked a ticket, God knows. Never, never, never. And here is the dance. The dance is, this is a straight couple of which, she has zero interest in him. No, she can't have interest in him, she's a child. But in her other relationships with other guys, she's perfectly a woman. And so here is the dance that you need to begin to enter, right? Does she want to stop being a child? That means that she's going to have to do a lot of stuff that till now she hasn't had to do. And is he willing to give up the guy who manages to take care of everything for her? Because that would mean that he has to imagine that she actually wants to stay with him, not because of what he does for her, but because of who he is. So there is all kinds of subtexts that need to be unearthed in order for these two people to be able to become an adult relationship and an erotic relationship. Okay? And I think that the thing that David Lay was talking about before was such a great concept. What was it? The heterosexual, romantic, bisexual? Yeah, this idea that, where you are sexually attracted to is not necessarily where you emotionally connect. Now, this is the part of mating in captivity that I was trying to deal with, How you take this conversation outside. There are people here, by the way. Oh, I have to tell you that, because I can't forget. The clip from the work, from the movie The Work, comes from a project called Mankind. I would be remiss if I didn't tell you that. Mankind is a project that went on for, I think, 8-10 years. And has been, it's hundreds and hundreds of hours, and has been tracking this biannual project that takes place in the Folsom prison. It's really an archive. I connected it to Byron Katie's work, but it's actually Mankind. So just to say you that. But that reminded me that there are two people here today who are of an organization called Everyman. And Everyman is an organization that creates retreats and groups and discussion groups for men, not therapeutic groups necessarily. That's one of the ways that this conversation is being taken outside. I think that the conversation, to me primarily, may I ask, how many of you have kids? Okay. If I may suggest, this is the first place you take it. Seriously. It's a different way of talking. I have 2 boys, and I literally would have them do 1 month of summer camp in the States and 1 month of summer camp abroad. So they got a kind of a comparative cultural experience throughout their years. And about a lot of these issues, there's some things that are very particular to the US. And there is a way in which we can shift things around by having very different conversations with our daughters and our sons, everybody. And that means that you have a conversation in which you do a few things to me that are the essence of what I would like to take outside, because it's simple. The first thing is this pink and blue thing that we heard about. The second thing is the idea that it is very important to cultivate friendships between boys and girls. friendships from age 3 onward, and not to have a situation where they have to hide it. Because if you have friendship between boys and girls, then you actually learn to relate to these girls as people with whom you have a kind of a sisterly thing, with whom you talk about what happens between you and this other girl that you are actually interested in. And you don't just have this unknown, mysterious continent that one day you have to become interested in just because of sex. Do you know what I'm talking about? You know? And the other thing is you talk about basically, you know, do you like this person? You know, do you have a... When you go in Belgium, you know, it's very common that a 5-year-old comes to dinner and then somebody says, and do you have a girlfriend? You know, nobody thinks twice about this idea. You know, tienes una novia. It's the same in Spanish. It's like there's a whole language that explains that you fall in love at every age. So it's an integrated thing in your life. It's not something you have to go and learn later on. That doesn't mean that these cultures don't have their own issues about and dichotomies and all of that. But I think there is a whole kind of integrated conversation about sex that you can have. I also think this is very problematic. In US is the only Western country that doesn't have a public health policy on adolescent sexuality. The only. It has had campaigns about abstinence, and as a result, it has more STIs, earlier onset of sexual activities, and more teenage pregnancies than the liberal Dutch. That's another piece, you know. Find a way to have the schools talk about something. You do something, the schools do some things, you know, and then maybe the summer camps will do some things too. I mean, that's for me the beginning. I do think that it starts much earlier rather than the repair shop later. You know, how I understand the masculinity paradox. Look, I called it the masculinity paradox because I wanted to say it's complex. But if you call it the masculinity complex, then it looks like they are complexed, you know? Like a complex in French, you know? It's like it's a different... So it was simply to say, here is this category called men that really requires interesting thinking about it at this moment. Somehow it's been a given, and it's no longer just a given. And what goes in there? And I really don't think it is just a story of power and vulnerability. I think it's a lot richer than that. You know, and so that's really what to me it's, what are the scripts that are available to men and to boys? It's very interesting. If women become pilots, they think they've become pilots. They don't wonder if it has made them less woman. If men become nurses, they have to prove that they are still men. And that notion of how women have entered all these territories that men have vacated often, and how will men enter territories that are actually quite needed at this moment and not instantly experience them as emasculating. There are two words that don't exist in the feminine. One is emasculated and the other is loser. Think about it. That doesn't mean women don't have their bane, huh? But it is very interesting. These two words that are just like crushes on guys, you know, just such access like this, just speak volumes. That whole notion that you can take that thing away as if it is really what I talked earlier, so fragile. So that's what I mean by the masculinity paradox. It's really this is an interesting moment in which we can, and I think Terry spoke to that too, is that we offer to the category men the opportunity for many more scripts than the ones that have been currently available. And this is not about making this less manly. It's simply about saying there's many more ways to be a man, because there is not one size fits all. And for nobody and for no relationships, for that matter. Now, I am really, it is true that I'm interested in this question of the ambivalence of the woman towards the man who, to whom she wonders if she can lean against, okay? To whom and this is a work that women have to do. How do you let a man not be, you know, all powerful in front of you, just experience whatever he's experiencing without instantly, it's two things. It's A, the feeling that you have to take care of them, and the resentment that you have to take care of them. And that has to do with your mama and the history of mothers. where it's not just your personal mother, it's mothers. It's the story, this idea that this is the instant thing you have to do, rather than just be there, let it happen, and trust the fear that when a guy goes like this, that he's going to just turn into a puddle, and that you will have to pick him up, and that therefore, who's going to be there for you, and all the people that you have taken care of, and all of that. This is one of the scripts that women are grappling with. That the I do for everybody. I do for everybody. There's another piece I will add to this. It was, there's something that Sharon said to me at one of the breaks today. When we saw the end, how many of you thought the woman laughed because she was anxious or nervous, not because she was trying to be mean to the guy? Right. Nevertheless, both end. She was nervous because she didn't want to tell him, because she actually didn't want to tell him the very thing that was going to be hurtful, but she was telling it to him in the laughter. It's both ends. It's not the intention only, it's also the simple consequence of the behavior. One of the things that I learned from this fantastic researcher called Marta Meana is that when you think about it, and this goes to the arousal, and this goes to the caregiving, and this goes to the power and the money, it's actually all interconnected, is this. You will probably hear many straight guys tell you, nothing turns me on more than to see her turn. Correct? Because many of them don't want the service economy, the begging position, the just get it over with, the go, I'll do whatever it takes so you can go to sleep. That is not what they want anymore. That's a change of generation. How many of you have heard straight women tell you in your office, nothing turns me on more than to see him turned on? I rest my case. Because what does she say? If she doesn't say that, then what is it that she says? She says, nothing turns me on more than to be the turn on. Because if the social role of the woman is the caregiving role, then the route to sexual arousal and desire and connecting to one's own erotic self is the freedom of burden of caretaking and the ability to think about herself. Hence, female sexuality is highly narcissistic. And we don't think about it like that because we are used to thinking about the man and the narcissism and the selfishness. But there is a whole voice, this is one of many, by the way, of course, that actually talks about a certain generosity on the side of men and a certain kind of selfishness that is needed on the side of women in order to be able to tap into her own erotic sensation and responses. Now, and this goes to another thing that you talked about with the power. I think that this doesn't take anything away from what Virginia talked about, but I don't particularly, well, whatever. I work with other stories as well that I hear, is this. There was an article in the New York Times not too long ago that really talked about all male sexuality is predatory. And it had more responses than any other article, I think, this year. But I thought there's a different way I want to look at it. There are a bunch of them. But I would say that if I turn it around and I say actually female sexuality is quite narcissistic because it counteracts with the burden of caretaking, which is often the primary erotic block in women, then I will say that it is not the predatoriness of men that is the issue as much as the fear of the predatoriness. The predatory fear, meaning, and this is particularly in men-women relationships, her response is the only thing that he has available to know if he's hurting or if he's pleasing. He completely depends on her in a way that he often will want to avoid. But that dependence is intrinsic. And part of why he says, nothing turns me on more than to see her turned on is because if she's turned on, then I know that I'm not hurting. Then I know that I'm not being predatory. So if the block for women is the burden of caretaking, the block for men is the predatory fear. And this is how I understand the blocks around arousal and the shifts that take place around caretaking and the devaluing that sometimes takes place when one person makes all the money and then looks at the other as a child. I think I combined all your questions. All right. I think... Let's do another round of this. I didn't talk about the anger of the trauma victim. That's the one thing we will come back. Okay, let's continue. Yes, Sarah, right here. I'll come to you.
So, Esther, I just wanted to say something regarding going to our children as the first point of contact. I also work with families. Like, for example, I came back like 3 weeks ago from Sweden, and I consulted with a parent group that, and the boys, little boys, were so traumatized because the mother thought that, you know, put them in girls' clothing and took the cars away for certain hours of the day and put them like in front of dolls and, you know, like strollers just to play with them because they wanted their sons to be in touch with their feminine side, and that's traumatizing for the child. You know, we should really be careful about this discourse. Or, for example, I was talking to a father, Iranian father, who said both of my daughters, they're not going to ballet, they are going to soccer games nowadays because they need to learn to compete and be aggressive. So we need to also have that, you know, on the back of our minds that, you know, some people really take the pendulum to the other side. So I just wanted to point that out.
So one interesting piece of data is that the country in Europe where Jordan Peterson is the most listened to at this moment is Sweden. Interesting, right? The most egalitarian society on the Scandinavian continent has a group of men, many men, saying, I love my dad, I don't look up to him. And then goes back to this kind of old code. Yeah. Yes, Doug. Oh.
Hi. Yeah, so I've been thinking all day about the idea of, that was suggested all the time, right, of men catching up to women, right? But what can we talk about on the other side of women learning to be patient, right? Because I feel that that's a lot of what I manage in the room with working with couples. So what can you talk about in terms of what we can do as couples therapists in handling that other side of women learning how to be more patient rather than becoming maybe aggressive or detached to the process?
Doug?
I just want to say a couple of things about your use of the word predator. I think it's a great teaching tool for us in this room, but it is not a helpful word in the clinical hour. I have sat in groups with men who are there for having out-of-control sexual behavior, and there's an idea in the sex addiction field of degeneracy that if somebody doesn't treat their addiction, they'll become more and more predatory as a sign of their addiction worsening. And this narrative comes into the family where a partner will be so worried about the safety of their children because the partner believes if their addiction relapses enough, they will sexually, non-consensually violate their own children as a worsening of their addiction. And the pain the men have had in the room when they think that the partner they love, the person they've been with for decades, actually believes that this man might actually non-consensually violate his own children as a sign of his sex addiction. It's such a painful place for the men to have to endure this perception on the part of their spouse, not because there's any indication that they could actually be non-consensual, but the fear that this addictive disorder will lead them into this behavior. It's one of the most painful dialogues I hear the men have in the group together with the other men. So I would just...
Correct me.
Yes.
Give me a different language.
Thank you, Esther, because you know this is what I like to have conversation with you about. I think it's a really useful training narrative, but from my language, I would find a way for the words consent and consent and non-exploitation to become part of the narrative of the couple. One of the most prideful, there's these 6 principles of sexual health I teach men, but one of the most prideful moments many men will have is I've never crossed the non-consent boundary, ever. And these are men who feel helpless about controlling their sexual behavior. And I'll say, we'll go from a strengths perspective, say, okay, let's start with the one you're confident you'll never do. Who's that? Who do you rely on? How does he manage the world? How did you come to believe you would never cross that boundary? We need to get to know that person. So that sometimes the consent boundary becomes the fact that you won't cross it, the beginning of the health and strength-based conversation. And most men are so adamantly appalled at the idea that somebody would perceive them as crossing that boundary with their own children.
And if I may, I would add to bridge that with the question that was just asked. I had a woman recently who came in. I thought it was an incredible thing. She sat down. She said, "I exploit men." I said, "Tell me more," you know. And then she basically said, "This one has a car. This one has a house. This one has a beach house. This one, you know, gave me bags. This one, you know." So when you talk about consensual and non-exploitive, I think that there is sometimes a notion that exploitation only goes from one direction to the other. There's a lot of other ways that exploitation happens between people. It doesn't have to be just women, you know, but people know when they're using people. And people know when they're using sex to get something from people. And people know when they're using whatever in order to marry people. Thank you. I will really pay attention. Yes. Yeah. No, the mic is coming.
Coming. I'm jogging to you. So again, as a single woman in New York City,
how many other people? No. Let me ask you one quick question. May I? 1 sec.
Yeah.
How many of you are in a relationship currently? And how many of you would like to be in a relationship? And how many of you, at least on occasion, would like to be out of your relationship you're in? Good. You're not alone. Let's go.
No, I mean I date, but no, but something I was
Closer to you. Closer.
Oh, sorry. So like I was off the market for like 4 years, and now I'm 35. And now that I've re-entered the market, I have been meeting more and more men who are really into Jordan Peterson, which, as a feminist with this healthy sexual identity, it's really frustrating. And one thing that I've been, especially with all the incel stuff and all the violence against women, and they often turn out to be the mass shooters. I guess what I'm curious about is like my pushback to them is against forced monogamy. Why can't we just legalize sex work? Like if they're so horny that it makes them violent, but then does that reinforce the patriarchy? Is my question.
Wait a second.
Look, I think the thing is this. There's a difference between consensual roughhousing and rape. There's a difference between play acting at something and having it done against your will. And I think it's important that we don't fall into the idea, very puritanical idea, that in order to control our behavior, we have to control our feelings. Feel what you feel, what you want, and then make grown-up decisions about what you're going to do about it. I think there's a tremendous resurgence of old-style masculinity because it's being threatened right now. But I also think there's a great resistance to that resurgence. I think we're in the middle right now, and I think that we have a part to play in that dialogue. So that's what I want to say about that. And thank you for handing me the mic when you didn't want to take the question.
Access to pornography actually decreases rates of sexual violence across the world. Access to pornography and sex work do decrease rates of sexual violence and sexual crime. But it's very, very important to understand that that's at a macro level, and that it's not that all men that listen to Jordan Peterson or that whatever, we have to look at those more sophisticated kind of issues. So if you're dating a guy with high antisocial traits that is angry towards women and is getting drunk, and then that's the guy we worry about. And again, as Sarah said earlier, it's the context that is so important, and we have to be very, very careful about over-attending to these one kind of variables.
Oh, okay, let me just, yeah, go. I think one of the thing I wanted to just add as you were talking is that you know, there's different answers to the fear of loss at this moment. There's a whole generation of men, boys coming up, of which probably half of them grew up primarily with a mother. And that means that their dinner table conversation was probably different too. And that means that they have a different ease with or comfort with a certain kind of relationality or relational language. I think what you will see generally when there is something that is challenged is that the responses are going on the extremes on both sides. You know, Peterson or Peterson as the symbol of a certain kind of response is one thing, and then there is a whole group of other men who are actually seeking every man and a bunch of other ways to actually expand the repertoire. But I think to what David was saying, one of the things that has really struck me is that it became very clear to me that promiscuity has nothing to do with comfort. I mean, you would think that people became more promiscuous because they became more sex positive, because they became more comfortable with sexuality, everybody. And what I think, when I say to a lot of the people, younger people that I work with, the millennial people I work with, the men and the women for that matter, I say, tell me something. If you like mountain climbing, do you like to be aware while you're doing it? If you like to drive a motorcycle, do you like to remember the next day that yesterday you had a great trip? Why the hell do you want to have something called sex of which you don't remember anything the next morning? Maybe you're not that comfortable with it to begin with, that you need to be totally smashed to engage in it, to then wake up the next morning and wonder, who was that? And hope that you get away fast enough so that you don't have to remember. This is sick. You know, so there is a complete paradox between the amount of sex people are having and what this actually represents, or the ease, or the respect, or the fun, or the pleasure, or the connect, whatever it is. You know, connection doesn't mean long term; it just means a good night. Sometimes, but that's two very different things. And for me, that anxiety that comes in here, that is really at the core of this thing that is debased, that is degraded, that is the body compared to that is the flesh compared to the spirit. There is multiple traditions that have really tried to make this thing called sex, and that of course is seen as the property of men because it is the sanctioned language with which men can talk about a bunch of things which they otherwise have no permission to talk about. In the same way that she has a sanctioned language called feelings, which she has to wrap into all kinds of layers of relatedness to be able to talk about sex. Every gender gets permission to talk about the same things, but each one's get the allocated vocabulary. Do you understand what I'm saying? And that makes it a much more of a societal thing than just a gender-specific thing. But it is obvious why the men can talk about sex, and sex is the language through which they talk about everything. So I have actually tried to come up with a different vocabulary, and I thought, instead of making it about feelings or emotions versus sex, I'm going to make it about verbs. Why verbs? Because, you know, I speak a lot of languages, and every time I learn a new language, I know that I have to go and find the auxiliary verbs, the main verbs that allow you to construct the basic sentences. And then I thought there are about 8, could be 10, it doesn't really matter the number, you know, basic relationship verbs that have no gender to them at the onset. They become gendered through your personal experience, through the culture you live in, etc., in the moment in history. And the verbs are like this. They're not in order, you know. To ask, to receive. You can go developmental with these verbs. You can literally see the baby as I talk and begin to see how we grow up with these verbs. To give, to take, to share, to play, or to create, to want, and to refuse. You know, I saw this little kid. I mean, it's a thing I watched many times. So when you have a kid and they're playing and they're running away, it's like, mine. You know, mine. There's no gender to this. You know, and it's a want, and it's a hold on to it. It's like that sense of, you know, and then after that, a whole life comes in that starts to create some people who want too much and some people who don't know to want enough. Some people who ask too much and some people who've never asked for anything. Some people who know to say no and some people who are terrified to say no and therefore have never known to say yes. And so you go down the verbs like that. I find that a very neutral, very simple, structured language through which you can delve into the entire, you know, relationship landscape with everybody, free of tags. Okay, that said, we are arriving at the end of our day. So, I wish I could get, yes? You're trying to tell me something? Yes? Yes?
There's a couple things. One, thank you everyone for being here today and being a wonderful audience. Group of participants. Couple things. One, we will be sending out a post-event email with resources. So everyone's books, all of the faculty's full list of books will be included. A couple additional links. We'll include a link to Everyman, which Esther's mentioned a couple times today, and a few other resources. CEs will be, you'll receive an email within 48 hours of today with instructions of what to do to apply for CEs. And if you have any questions about Esther's sessions platform. Nice.
Wow. Okay, so, if you want to be, what do they have to do?
So if you want to be, you can find all the information about the community on Esther's website, estherperel.com. If you take a picture of this link on the screens will take you directly to the page with all the information.
You can try it for free for 2 weeks, by the way.
That's true. There's a free 14-day trial, and hopefully next year we do an event like this again. But we hope to see you in that community as well as in person at these events. So that's all from me. You can wrap it up.
So there's no way to wrap this up. It's ... at the end of a sentence. To be continued, as we say at the end of many of our sessions. I wish I could say see you next week, but I won't. Feel free to write to us, to share with us what this is like. You know, I hope you won't just focus on the light or the temperature of the room, but the meat, you know. I thank Terry and Sarah and Alexandra and Rick and Doug and David and Virginia. Do I have everybody? And Paul. Where's Paul? He was standing there. Because I can't do this without them, and I couldn't do this without you. Thank you. Many of you have come to tell me, you know, you take these risks, you do that. The truth is, people, I am a little counterphobic, and it is with you that I get the strength to try out what I try out and to say what I say and to do what I do. It's you're invisible supports, you don't know it, but I think of you a lot. So thank you very, very much.